It was supposed to be his last blind date. Ethan Cole, the 36-year-old tech billionaire everyone called the Ice King, had promised his assistant that if this one didn't work out, he'd stop pretending he wanted love at all. Money, awards, and a Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park. He had everything. Everything except someone who saw him, not the headlines. The restaurant was quiet, candlelit, reserved for him like always. He checked his watch. 5 minutes late. 10, 15. Then she walked in, slightly breathless, clutching a small purse, apologizing to the hostess for being late. Her name was Grace Miller, 31, single mom, school teacher, and by far the most ordinary person who had ever agreed to meet him. She wore a soft blue sweater, jeans, and a kind of honesty you couldn't fake. "Sorry," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "My sitter canceled last minute and, well, I had to find someone fast." Ethan gave a polite nod, ready for another shallow conversation. But she didn't talk about his money. She didn't ask about his company or his car. Instead, she said, "You look tired. Really tired." That startled him. "Guess I've been working a lot." "You should eat something green once in a while," she smiled, gently teasing. "Your body's trying to keep up with your brain." He laughed, an unplanned, genuine sound. It had been years. They talked for hours. About everything and nothing. About how she taught second graders who didn't have enough to eat. How she worked nights tutoring just to afford rent. About her son Liam, who wanted to be an astronaut but was afraid of the dark. Ethan found himself telling her things he'd never said aloud. About losing his parents young. About building his empire from loneliness. About how success had become a shield. When the waiter brought the check, Grace reached for it instinctively. "Let me split it," she said. "No, really," Ethan protested, half amused. She smiled. "I teach kids not to take what they can't pay for. Let me do this one thing." That tiny act, simple, proud, unpretentious, hit him harder than any boardroom deal ever had. A week passed. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about her. When he found out the local school board was cutting art and science funding, he didn't send a check. He showed up, quietly, anonymous. He funded the entire program under a new name, Project Liam. When Grace found out, she was furious. "You didn't have to do that," she said, showing up at his office with tears in her eyes. "I know," Ethan said softly. "But I wanted to." There was a pause. Then she whispered, "You don't even know me that well." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But you reminded me who I am." 2 months later, Grace invited him to her son's school fair. It wasn't glamorous, just paper crafts, lemonade, and kids running around with sticky fingers. But Ethan had never felt more at peace. At one point, Liam tugged on his sleeve and said, "Mom says you build big things. Can you help me build a rocket?" Ethan knelt beside him. "Sure," he said, smiling. "But only if I get to be your assistant." Grace watched, heart full, realizing that sometimes the richest people aren't the ones with the most money, but the ones who learn how to give again. That night, as the fair lights faded, Ethan looked at Grace and said, almost shyly, "You know that blind date, it was supposed to be my last." Grace laughed softly. "And now?" He took her hand. "Now I hope it's my first real one." It was supposed to be his last blind date. Ethan Cole, the 36-year-old tech billionaire who owned half of Manhattan's skyline, didn't believe in fate, only strategy. He'd built his empire that way, calculated, efficient, emotionless. His friends called him the Ice King, and maybe they were right, because somewhere along the way, while building a world-changing company, he'd frozen out everything else that mattered. So when his assistant arranged one final blind date, he agreed. Not because he expected love, but because he was tired of pretending he didn't care. The restaurant was high above the city, candles flickering against the glass walls that overlooked Central Park. He sat alone, scrolling through his phone. 5 minutes passed, then 10, 15. He sighed. "Another no-show," he muttered. Then a voice. "Hi, I'm so sorry I'm late. My sitter canceled last minute." He looked up. She wasn't what he expected. No designer dress, no diamonds, no polished, practiced smile. Just a woman with warm brown eyes, a soft blue sweater, and hair she'd clearly brushed in a hurry. "I'm Grace," she said, catching her breath. "Thank you for waiting." Something about her honesty disarmed him. They ordered coffee. Then dinner. Then dessert they didn't need. The conversation flowed, awkwardly at first, then naturally, then deeply. She told him about her life, teaching second grade, juggling bills, raising her 7-year-old son. Liam? She laughed easily, spoke kindly, and didn't once mention his money. Ethan found himself listening. Really listening. "You know," she said, looking at him across the table, "you don't smile much. You should. You look human when you do." He laughed, and it surprised him how good it felt. The next day, Ethan couldn't focus. He kept replaying the evening in his mind, the way she'd looked at him, not as a billionaire, but as a person. Days turned into weeks. They talked again, once over coffee, then again at the park where Grace brought Liam. The boy ran straight to him, holding a toy rocket. "Mom says you build big things," Liam said. "Can you help me make this fly?" Ethan smiled. "Only if you promise to teach me how to dream again." Grace laughed, watching them. She couldn't explain it, but Ethan didn't seem like the cold CEO people described online. He was gentle, quiet, lonely maybe. A few weeks later, Grace mentioned the school's science program was being cut due to funding. The disappointment in her voice stayed with Ethan long after she left. The next morning before sunrise, he made a decision. Not as a billionaire, but as a man who finally cared again. Through an anonymous donation, the entire science and art program was restored, under a new initiative called Project Liam. When Grace found out, she marched straight to his office. "You did this," she said, holding the newspaper. He looked up from his desk, feigning innocence. "Did what?" "You think I wouldn't notice?" she said, voice trembling. "You can't just fix my life with money, Ethan." He stood slowly. "I wasn't fixing your life, Grace. I was fixing mine." Her eyes softened. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "You really don't get it, do you? You don't have to earn kindness to deserve love." That night, for the first time in years, Ethan sat alone in his apartment. Lights dim, city quiet, realizing she was right. Maybe love wasn't something you buy. Maybe it's something you learn. Months passed. Ethan visited the school more often, helped with projects, ate cafeteria food he pretended to like. And every time he saw Grace, surrounded by children, laughter and life, something inside him thawed. One evening, he found her sitting on a bench after class, watching the sunset. "You know," she said softly, "you've changed." He smiled. "You think so? You look like a man who finally found what he wasn't looking for." He laughed quietly. "Maybe I did." The school fair came that weekend. Grace was busy at the bake sale, Liam tugging on Ethan's sleeve, asking if he'd help with the rocket competition. Ethan spent the whole day there, cheering, laughing, covered in paint and glitter by the end of it. When Liam's rocket finally launched, high, spinning against the golden sky, Ethan looked at the boy and said, "You did that, kiddo." Liam grinned. "We did it." Grace stood nearby, watching with tears in her eyes. Later that night, as they walked toward her car, she said, "I still can't believe you came to all this. You could have been anywhere in the world tonight." "I am," he said, taking her hand gently. "I'm exactly where I want to be." She smiled, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow, or his company, or the endless noise of success. Just this moment. He glanced at her and said quietly, "You know, that blind date was supposed to be my last." Grace looked up at him, amused. "And now?" He smiled. "Now I hope it's my first real one." Epilogue. A year later, Ethan Cole didn't just run a billion-dollar company. He co-founded a foundation, one that funded single parents, teachers, and children's education across the country. And every letter, every success story, every smiling photo from a classroom came back to the same name, Grace, because she hadn't just changed his life. She reminded him what life was,